this meeting that I went to where someone was really horrible to me, because it does happen from time to time. They know that there is somebody always there who can look after them and to talk through all of that. We're very fortunate at NICE that we have this dedicated resource. And I think that sometimes we forget how fortunate we are and how other organisations can struggle without this dedicated resource. But it's an enormously important part of being able to support the lay members, to support the patients, but also to make sure that the organisation is keeping up to date with the most appropriate ways of engaging with people. But I do acknowledge that it's a real advantage to be able to have dedicated staff whose only job it is to support patient involvement within the organisation. But we, as well as the sort of pastoral support that we're there for people when they've had a really bad time, or if they're confused about something and they want to talk about it, we also offer very formal training to the people who work with us. And we don't train people in being good committee members. We don't train them in those kind of communication type skills and how to have your voice heard and all of those kind of things. We train our chairs in that kind of thing to make sure that they take account of everybody around the table. But what we've developed is a training program that looks specifically at the job they have to do on a guidance development group. And so our training will cover all of the issues that I've put up on the slide, what they can do as patients to influence each of these kind of processes. So from the outset of a guideline, you try and set the clinical questions that you want the evidence to answer. And it's really important that the patients know what it is they can put into the pot to say, I would like you to ask this question of the evidence. We introduce them to the different types of research studies there are out there and how different types of research can answer different types of question. Again, something I will come back to, because the issue of the quantitative research versus the qualitative research is a perennial problem. Well, not a problem, but it's an issue. So we take them through appraising and evaluating evidence. We get them to do a critical appraisal exercise themselves, so they have experience of analysing a piece of research for its strengths and weaknesses. We teach them about key statistical terms. We teach them about how you go from a piece of evidence to turning that into a guideline recommendation. And we talk about health economics and cost effectiveness, because for most people, this is the most difficult philosophical bit of what NICE does for them to get their heads around. And being able to allow people to make the distinction between the cost of treatment and its cost effectiveness is a really, really crucial development. And so it's really important that they understand the importance of why we look at value for money as well as how well something works in terms of treating people. During the training, we also give people the opportunity to hear from people who've been through the process before them, people who have been patient members of our groups before, so they can hear what some of the issues were and how they were tackled. So we're kind of building on past learning as well, trying not to lose that information that goes from group to group. So we try and do this training very early on in the process, very soon after someone's been recruited to a group. But also, maybe 6 months before a guideline is published, we will offer some more follow-up training that concentrates primarily on the language of recommendations and issues for implementation. I was asked to talk about dissemination of guidelines to a lay audience, and I feel a bit of a fraud because we don't do very much of it, and it's to my great shame that we don't do very much of it, and it is my great ambition that we will do something more about it in the future. But I will tell you about what we do. All of our clinical guidelines are produced in versions for patients and the public, known as Understanding NICE Guidance, which is a term that I hate and will be changing as soon as possible, because I think it's patronizing. But what can you do? What our patient versions are, and this is a really crucial distinction, they're not detailed patient information. The example that's up on the screen is for early and locally advanced breast cancer. This document wouldn't tell you an awful lot about what breast cancer is. What it will do is tell you, in simple language, what NICE has recommended to the health service. This is the best treatment, according to the evidence, that we recommend you should receive as a patient. We feel very, very strongly that the patient organisations are much better placed than we are to provide that supporting information around it. So we feel very strongly that what we should do is make sure that what we have said is clearly understandable. And because we believe the patient organisations are very important in providing the rest of the information, we also, you probably can't see that very clearly, but there is a section at the back of each of these patient versions that includes the contact details of the relevant key patient organisations, so that people reading these documents know where they can go for further support and information. Now, at the moment, all of this is available free of charge on our website. It's available in a PDF version and a Word version. But we are very reliant on the patient organisations to help disseminate this guidance. At the moment, we don't have a formal strategy for disseminating our patient versions. But we are slowly building up a network of links into local hospitals where they have patient and public involvement leads themselves, and we're building relationships with those people to try and get them to promote the patient versions of our guidance. I'll come back to that a little bit in a minute. We've talked about how people are involved and what we do to support them. But I haven't yet talked about what we do to make sure that patients' views are incorporated into the guidance, as well as having patients sitting around the table. And these are some of the options that are available and that we have done. We don't do all of these for all guidelines, but they are available as options, and my team helps support these where they can. What we do expect to happen in every single piece of guidance is that there's a formal analysis of good qualitative research on patients' views and experiences. Now, that's not always there, but we would expect that it would be looked for and that it would be analysed and its findings would be incorporated into the guidance. I've talked about how we have the expertise of patients on the groups that develop the guidance, and we have that. But we also have a number of people who act as peer reviewers for our guidelines. And so we would send out draft recommendations to people who we know have expertise from a lay perspective on each of the topics. But what we've done to try and amplify the evidence base on patients' views for a number of topics is used some quite low-level qualitative techniques ourselves. So we've conducted a number of focus groups, primarily with people who are too ill to join a group, or who are afraid to be part of a group because of the stigma that's attached to their illness or their condition. And so we have focus groups because it becomes a safe and anonymous environment in which they can share our views. We've also done a number of interviews with people to make sure that their views are incorporated with people. The issue of how we involve children is a huge one, and generally we try to engage organisations who work with children all the time to do this work for us, and we've done a number of workshops and taken recommendations to children's conferences and things like that to make sure that young people's views are represented, even if they can't be at the table drafting the recommendations. And most of our mental health guidance has a whole chapter that's devoted to testimonials from patients, narratives, their story, their life story of living with a particular condition. And those testimonials and those narratives are used to make sure that the contextual information that surrounds the hard numerical data is taken into account. I've talked before about what it is that patients bring to the table, and I won't go through these again, but what I want to talk about now is this issue of impact and added value, because we are always asked, so you have patients on your group, does it really make any difference, or are you just doing it so you can say, we have patients on our group, we've ticked that box. So I want to talk about where we've demonstrated that the guidance is different, and I would say improved as a consequence of having patients on board. And so I'm going to go through a couple of case studies, which I hope is okay. We recently reviewed and updated our guideline on schizophrenia, and we looked at the evidence for the use of antipsychotic drugs. And what the evidence showed was that there seemed to be very little difference in how well these drugs worked between each other. Each of these drugs worked more or less the same way. But what the patients told us, and we call mental health patients service users in the UK, which is why a different terminology, but what the service users told us was that the side effects of those drugs were the one thing that influenced whether or not they stayed on them. And it was the difference in the side effect profiles that meant one drug worked better for that particular patient. Not that that drug was more effective from an evidence-based point of view, but this is about patient preferences. And so our guidance recommends that the clinician and the patient talk about the different side effect profiles of the different drugs, and then the patient can choose which one he or she would like to take. And if it doesn't work, they can try another one. But it absolutely is about the values and the preferences of that patient. So would the patient risk weight gain if they knew that the voices in their head would stop? Or is actually weight gain a really important issue that they wouldn't want to risk, and so would another drug be more appropriate? And so we've taken the evidence and put it into such a way that we can allow for patient preferences. And this is often a difficulty with evidence-based guidance, because the evidence says that this is best, therefore this must happen. But actually, the patient's values and preferences might mean that can be challenged. We looked at some guidance on the treatment of psoriasis skin condition. All of the clinical research told us that the extent or the amount of psoriasis on the patient's body was what was important and was what most affected the patient's quality of life. And therefore, that's all the researchers looked at, was reducing the size of the outbreak of the psoriasis. The patients told us that they didn't care how much of it they had. What mattered to them was where it was on their bodies. So if it was on their faces or on their joints, it was far, far worse than the extent or the amount that it was. And so we were able to challenge the outcomes that the research had looked at, and it meant that we could challenge the calculations that had been made about how effective the particular medication was. I talked earlier about questioning assumptions. We looked at a piece of guidance on kidney dialysis for people with kidney failure. The evidence told us that it was equally clinically and cost-effective for the patient to have their dialysis in hospital or in their home. And everyone on the committee said, well, people would want it at home then. Of course they would want it at home. Nobody wants to go to hospital. But what the patients told us was they really hated having this enormous clunking machine in the corner of their living room, reminding them all the time of how ill they were and how dependent they were on it. And they preferred to go to hospital maybe 3 times a week for 4 hours and then forget about it. And so again, we came up with a recommendation that said that the patient's preference should be taken into account, because there was no difference in the clinical and cost effectiveness. So if people wanted it at home, they should have it at home, but if they wanted to go to hospital, they should go to hospital. This is the